Hello everyone. In this video we're going to cover a classic form of academic writing, the 5-paragraph essay. It's so prevalent in fact that it's sometimes considered cliché, but when it's done well, it's a great tool to have in your arsenal. So before we begin, let's talk about why you want to master this form of writing. After all, it's not the only way to write an essay. There are several ways that can be done. So this is only a tool. However, it is the fast food solution of academic essay writing. Knowing this form will help you to be able to write intelligently and adjust for any other situations that require a different approach. It allows you to get started on a topic and produce something that will be acceptable even if you feel like you're floundering at the beginning. So it's worth knowing how this is done, and then you can adjust intelligently from this starting point. In this video, we want to make a distinction between report and essay. They're not the same thing, and we're going to be focused on essays. So you may be wondering, what is the difference? Well, good question. Did somebody say bacon? We're going to use this burger analogy, so if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, this may not be the best presentation of a 5-paragraph essay in your book. But let's talk about some of the things that a report that's 5 paragraphs and an essay would have in common. We'll start with that, the common ground, and then we'll talk about the difference, which I'm likening to bacon. So first of all, both kinds will have a smooth introduction with a few seeds and some dressing, like the bun, and that would be your introductory paragraph out of the 5 paragraphs. And then in the middle of the essay or the report, whichever it is, you'll have 3 meaty body paragraphs that are full of information and facts. It would be basically just information and facts in a report. In an essay, that information and facts are going to be centered around what's coming. You want a soft, smooth conclusion that supports your entire essay, and it's going to taste similar to that top bun, which was your introductory paragraph. It should have some common content and feel like a smooth landing. So that's your final paragraph. So the 2 buns plus the 3 patties equal the 5 paragraphs that make up your essay. You'll also want to make sure that you have creamy transitions that melt between the layers. So this is kind of a cheeseburger thing. The difference between the report and an essay is a distinct thesis that is loaded with caloric content. In other words, the thesis is the main thing that gives flavor to the essay versus the report. It sets the direction for the whole thing. So we're going to talk at length about what goes into a thesis and what all of these parts of this essay might be. At this point, you might be thinking, that sounds overwhelming to do all of that in one sitting. I'm not sure where to start. So you know that you have to write in order to form an essay. You've got to put words on paper. They have to be in paragraphs. But there's a process here. So we know that we start out somewhere, right? Before you write, it makes sense that you've got to organize yourself. You've got to figure out how you're going to structure these 5 paragraphs and maybe what's going to go in them. But how do you even get started on organization when you're writing about a new topic or something like that? I would submit to you that the most important part of the writing process is this first step in the process that I like to have students remember, and that is thinking. You have to give serious thought to what you're going to write about before you can even organize it well, let alone write. Thinking involves reading what other people have to say about the topic, mulling over your response, asking questions of the information that you're reading, trying to figure out if there's something else you should look up or research. All of that needs to happen before you try to organize any of this into a paper. So if you've done your thinking, you've done your organizing, you go ahead and you write your essay, you still do have a couple of steps, and we just hit those quickly now. You'll want to reevaluate you want to evaluate what you've written, go back over it. You don't just slap it together and turn it into a teacher. And then you want to be ready on your own and with the teacher's feedback to rewrite and revise what you've come up with. That's a huge part of the writing process. You can remember these steps with the acronym TOWER: think, organize, write, evaluate, and rewrite. So we'll go through how those steps look in the 5-paragraph essay. Don't forget that that first step is turning on your brain. Thinking is the foundation of that writing tower. So you want to think about the question that is in your prompt. You write an essay because you're told to, usually. Most people don't just set out to write an essay one day for the fun of it. So let's pretend you've been given an essay prompt in a history class, and your teacher wants you to write an essay on how World War I turned into a global conflict. How did we get from just a couple of European powers mad at each other into a world war? So that's the question in your prompt. You're going to have to start researching what happened in the lead up to World War I, which countries were initially involved, what sorts of things were happening, and what drew in other people, and how did this become a bigger conflict. So you're going to be doing reading and research, and that's active reading, where you're really looking for anything in your reading that has any indication of how this became a global conflict. You're putting sticky tabs on those pages, or you're writing on your book, if that's okay with your situation with that book. It's not a library book or something. You want to take notes. Make notes on the most important things, and keep them in your notes which sources those came from in your research. You want to look for connections and patterns. Is there anything that all of these issues have in common? What else can you draw from your reading, and what most tightly connects to the question that you are supposed to be answering for your professor or your teacher? Once you've done a good bit of reading and thinking and trying to figure things out, it's time to start organizing your thinking. You've found the beef in your research, you know the facts, you have ideas about what to say. Now what? All right, now it's time to start the organizing process. I like to provide students with a planning worksheet, and this is not intended to be something arduous. It's supposed to be helpful. So in the parts of the planning worksheet, up at the top, you see in yellow, that's a spot where I ask students to write in their thesis statement, which is a sentence that captures where the entire paper is going. And we'll talk in a couple of minutes about exactly how that's supposed to be written. But that governs the direction of the entire paper and sets how it's all going to fit together. And then, where the beef patties are, you have your 3 main body paragraphs. And those each will cover a topic that is a subtopic to your main question. So for example, if we're telling the teacher how World War I became a global conflict, maybe we're talking about how unrestricted submarine warfare from Germany caused that conflict to escalate by casualties that were inflicted on neutral parties. So you would have in your topic area for this paragraph, this would be unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany. And you would explain which neutral countries were hit in your paragraph, and you would explain their reactions. You would talk about anything else that happened in connection with submarine warfare. Were there any specific incidents that were particularly egregious? And what, if anything, broke the camel's back, so to speak? So that's what would fill a body paragraph. For your second body paragraph, you'd have to have some other factor that caused it to escalate into a global conflict, and you need something else for your third paragraph, and that all comes out of that thinking and research that you've done. All right, so you want to make sure in those body paragraphs that they are beefy. This is supposed to be solid writing, so you want to make sure that you begin every body paragraph with a strong topic sentence. I'm making the assumption here that if you're watching this video, you already know how to craft a paragraph. You want to fill it with relevant information and analysis from your research. Then you wrap up with a touch back to your thesis. Well, you want to make sure that your paragraph is connected to where your whole paper is going and that your reader can see that connection. These should be good, solid paragraphs. What you don't want for your reader is a situation like what you see here. This is from a Wendy's commercial back in the 80s, and it was funny and became iconic, and says the expression, "Where's the beef? Where's the beef?" That's where this came from. The lady on the left is yelling back behind the counter, "Where's the beef? I don't see the beef." So you don't want that for your essay. You want to make sure that your body paragraphs are the star of the show. The buns are just a little bit on the top and the bottom compared to where the real message of your paper is in those beefy body paragraphs. So with the body paragraph discussion under our belts, let's go on to writing strong thesis statements. That's a critical sentence in your essay. So let's talk about what has to happen with those. That's where you decide how to focus your essay. We talked about that already, and you want to make sure that you're making an analytical claim, that you aren't just stating plain facts. So let's talk about how that works. A three-pronged thesis statement, which is what you'll be using in most cases for a classic 5-paragraph essay, includes two parts. It includes an arguable assertion. That an assertion is a statement that you make, and that statement needs to be a little bit controversial. It needs to be something that someone can disagree with. It doesn't have to be wildly controversial, but someone could take a differing opinion. You also want to preview how you plan to support that assertion in your 3 body paragraphs. So your sentence will do 2 things. It will set forth that assertion that you're making about your topic and give the reasons that your assertion is true in your opinion. So you're writing one sentence. You get all of this done in one sentence. It's a thesis sentence, not a thesis rambling. And the 2 parts are that statement that I like to call a statement with an invisible I think. It seems to help students to be able to write a sentence with an I think and then cross out the I think. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. And then you have to have the here's why part of the sentence, and that's that sneak preview of your 3 supporting paragraph topics. Let's take a look at how this looks with the prompt that I've been using as an example. In this case, you might say, I think World War I became a global conflict because blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. Okay, and that's how you would word a simple thesis statement. You can boil it down to a formula. The I think is invisible. You don't want that in your paper, but it might help you get started on what it takes to make an assertion. The assertion is World War I became a global conflict because of these 3 reasons. And someone else could say, no, I don't think that the unrestricted submarine warfare was really one of the reasons that this became a global conflict. I think it was this, this, and this. That's how that's a little bit arguable. This is not a wildly arguable assertion here, but it works. So another way you might word that, you don't have to put it in exactly that format. You could switch things around and you can say, I think such and such, such and such, and such caused World War I to become a global conflict. But notice that in both cases, you're getting all of that information packed into one concise sentence. Your teacher should never have to go hunting to figure out where your thesis is. It should be pretty clear because it almost follows a formula, and it's going to state the topics of your body paragraphs and make some sort of a statement about those. So let's look at some thesis statements and talk about what's wrong with them. And I'm going to use some hashtagging in order to hopefully make this a little bit fun, and we'll go through how some of these do not work. So this paper will perform an in-depth examination of the difference between scientific creationism and evolutionary theory. So what's wrong with this thesis statement? Hopefully you can see a couple of things right off the bat. First hashtag is bragging on your own paper. Don't make claims in your thesis statement or anywhere else about what your paper will accomplish. And to say that you can perform an in-depth examination of the difference between scientific creation and evolutionary theory in a 5-paragraph essay is beyond what can be accomplished. There are books on this that don't cover the whole thing. All right, what else is wrong? There's nothing arguable here, except I guess that I would say you can't do that. But you're not making a claim that's arguable. You're saying that you're going to examine scientific creation and evolutionary theory. Oh, okay. I can't argue with the fact that you think you're going to examine both. Fine. But that's nothing for me to argue with. I can't disagree with that. And it just lacks focus. There's no telling me where you're going to go with this examination, and I don't know how you're going to support anything you're trying to say. I don't know what you're going to try to say here. Are you going to say one is right, the other is wrong? And if so, how are you going to support that? So this thesis statement is not a thesis statement, and it doesn't work for those reasons. Let's look at a couple more. Creationism and macroevolutionary theory are in sharp contrast to one another. Okay, well, you see any problems here? My first hashtag for this one is duh. Yes, of course they are. There's nothing to argue with here. We know that creationism and macroevolutionary theory are completely different. So you're not telling the reader anything they don't already know, and you're not giving any indication of what's going to be in your paper. So that means there's no focus here. And there's, as I mentioned, nothing to argue with. So that doesn't work as a thesis statement. All right, how about this one? What people believe about the origin of the Earth is absolutely fundamental. Okay, so what have we got here? That's a big claim. When you use a word like absolutely, you're wading in deep, and someone could certainly argue with you. Some people may not think it's any big deal at all what people believe about how the Earth came into being. They may say, it doesn't matter what you believe, I don't care. And it isn't important, and people can live their lives just fine without worrying about that. So we have arguable, and we definitely have something, we have a claim here. I would not necessarily appreciate the use of the word absolutely in there. I might tone that down a bit, but it is definitely arguable, as I mentioned. The problem here is no focus. Where are we going with this? Okay, so it might be fundamental, but so what? And how are you supporting the statement that it is fundamental? So it doesn't tell us what are we going to see in those 3 body paragraphs. So that's not going to work. All right, let's look at another one. I think that questionable dating methods, irreducible complexity, and the second law of thermodynamics make macroevolutionary theories unsupportable. Alrighty, so here we have a list of 3 things at the beginning that clue me in that this is probably the 3 body paragraph topics. These are the 3 supporting issues that the student is going to use to make the case for their assertion, and they are asserting there at the end of the sentence that macroevolutionary theories are unsupportable. So they're going to say that, and if it's in the order it should be, then the first paragraph, because of the way things are listed in this thesis statement, the first paragraph should cover questionable dating methods. The second should cover irreducible complexity, and the third paragraph should cover the second law of thermodynamics. And the 3 of those paragraphs are going to work together if the student is doing their job to show how macroevolutionary theory is unsupportable. So this is looking good. This is the best candidate we've had yet. There's one major problem with this, and that is no one cares what you think. I say that with kind of a chuckle, but the reason we don't put I think in there is that it's not good academic manners, for one thing, but you want to go ahead and make your assertion. I cannot argue with the fact that that's what you think. If you take away that I think, then you're making an assertion that I can argue with. Does that make sense? So you're not really making an arguable assertion if you leave the I think in there. You got to remember that it has to be invisible. So otherwise, this is good. This works for a thesis statement. So that's what you're after. Okay, so the key points, just to review, of what a thesis statement needs to have is that it's got that arguable assertion that someone can disagree with. and then it will contain supporting subpoints so the reader has an indication of how the essay will be organized. And that means mentioning those 3 body paragraph topics very briefly. You don't start telling about those topics. You just mention them. You know, as we go back, if we were to go back to that other thesis statement, questionable dating methods, I may not know anything better than to think that that has to do with people dating. I may not know that it has to do with carbon-14 dating being problematic. And I don't need to in the thesis statement. I just need to know where we're going with this. Okay, so let's take a moment to nail down where your thesis statement belongs in your paper for a classic 5-paragraph essay. You think it should be at the end? Make sure your reader got the point, option A. In your graphic organizer or your planning form, but not in your essay. At the end of the introductory paragraph, at the beginning of the introductory paragraph, or in the middle of your introductory paragraph. All right, so the answer is at the end of your introductory paragraph. And that's where it belongs. That's where your instructor is going to be looking for it. It shouldn't be the very first sentence you lead off with in your paper. It shouldn't be buried somewhere in the middle of a paragraph. It is the sticking the landing of your introductory paragraph and saying, now I'm into the meat of my essay. It's that bacon. Think about where the bacon goes in the burger, and you'll be putting your putting your thesis statement in the correct position. All right, when you're done to that point, it's time to think about the buns. You want to consider how you will ease into your paper with a relevant hook that's going to draw in your reader's attention. You will start out broad and then narrow down and bridge to your thesis statement from your hook. So what you want in your hook is something that's not the facts that you're going to cover in the rest of your paper. So if we go back to our how did World War I example, how did World War I become a global conflict? In the paragraphs of that paper, we're not going to be talking about what it was like to live in the trenches. But maybe you could talk about the life in the trenches because that's iconic about what happened in World War I, and talk about how many men were sitting there and what that was like very briefly, 2 to 3 sentences, just to engage your reader's imagination. And then you transition to how did we end up with guys in trenches? World War I became a global conflict because A, B, and C. And that would be your thesis sentence. Other options that students use for hooks are to explore a definition of a particular keyword. Use a quote that's similar but that's not going to be used later in your paper that eases into the topic. You might tell a short story or an anecdote, begin an analogy that you'll wrap up in your conclusion. Whatever you start in that hook, that bun, top bun, should have some flavor that's the same as the bottom bun. So you can use the same ideas from your hook as a way to tie things off at the end of your paper with that bottom bun, which we're calling the concluding paragraph. So at this stage, you've done your thinking, and you've done your organizing. So it's time to go ahead and write your essay. So you use that planning form, you've filled in all your facts, you know where you got your facts, and you're ready to sit down and just crank it out. And trust me, that's a skill you want in college, to be able to crank out a paper, because occasionally students procrastinate and deadlines are looming and you got to be able to get it done fast. And that's where this model really helps. So you get it written. What's next? All right, so you've just tapped on your computer and you've got an essay, you've got 5 paragraphs. Chances are it's going to be rough, so you need to do some polishing. At a minimum, you need to go through and make sure that you have some cheese between those patties. Make good transitions between your paragraphs within the essay, and be sure that those transitions somewhere in those vicinity before you start the topic sentence of a new paragraph, have you pointed back to that thesis? Does your reader remember where you're going with this whole essay? It's a good idea to go ahead and verify your structure. I, as an instructor, when I've asked for a 5-paragraph paper, and even if I'm allowing students to vary the structure to a 4-paragraph or 6 to 8 paragraph paper, they I still look for these elements first thing when I open up a document, and I kind of check the formatting, and then the first thing I'm looking for is that thesis statement, and I want to find that at the bottom of the introductory paragraph. And it should be obvious to me, yep, that's the thesis statement. So you want to check your own paper for that. Then at the very first sentence of the first body paragraph, I want to see that that sentence matches the first thing you said in your thesis statement that you were going to cover as support. And then the second body paragraph, I'm going to read the very first sentence of that and see if that matches the second thing you said you were going to use as support, and so on. I read the very first sentence of the third body paragraph and check to see that that matches. Then I'll scan the conclusion and see if I see where you touched back to your thesis and wrapped it all together. So at that point, when I've opened a student's paper, so far I've read 4 or 5 sentences at the most. And unless it's sloppy and I haven't found what I'm looking for, then I give up. I start at the beginning. Eventually I find, hopefully, the thesis statement. I mark it and say, this is not well placed. If I read down through the body paragraphs and you didn't actually set it up and frame it with a topic sentence and a connection to the thesis at the end, then I have to discuss that with a student. These are things you can check for yourself, though, before you ever turn it into your teacher. So you should go through and check those key sentences. Those are the ones you must nail. The rest of your writing, you want to polish it, but there's a little bit more flexibility on how you go about that part. And with that, once you've done that process, then you are ready to serve it up for some feedback. So you've done the writing, you've done some self-evaluation, you're ready to give it to someone else to look over and get some feedback, and then you're going to do any revision and rewriting that is necessary to polish it up and finalize it.